Today I'd like to look at a Buxtehude chorale prelude, one of the two on Komm, Heiliger Geist, Herre Gott. And I suppose the first question is, why did Buxtehude write two chorale preludes on this particular hymn? In fact, when I come to think of it, Bach also wrote two of his 18 Leipzig chorale preludes on that same hymn. So I suppose we could ask the question in a broader sense, why have so many composers written great chorale preludes on this particular melody? In itself, it's perhaps not such a striking melody that would justify such great works. But I suppose that the answer is that it is one of the core hymns in the church year. It's the hymn that was sung and still is, in fact, at Pentecost in the German Lutheran Church. It's also, incidentally, the first hymn in the Pentecost section in the modern Norwegian hymn book, and it's been in the Norwegian hymn book since the 1830s, I think, but it's perhaps not one of the ones which is used most often over here. But nonetheless, it is a very great and influential hymn in its own right. But back to Buxtehude, the chorale prelude is very much in Buxtehude's normal chorale prelude idiom, in the sense that the chorale melody is rather rhapsodically decorated across the top, with the different stanzas given a couple of bars rest between each stanza, and those are filled in with the left hand and pedal, which most of the way is in a kind of supporting idiom, although it does become slightly more interesting during the rests for the chorale melody. At one point, quite late on in the chorale prelude, the accompaniment, the left-handed pedals, do become more imitative, more figurative, if you like, more interesting. But on the whole, they have a slightly laid-back kind of function. But it's a wonderful and beautiful work, and there is something so very, very appealing about it. It begins and ends, incidentally, with a one-octave scale going up. We've talked before in other contexts, particularly in terms of Bach, about scales being indicative of movement between heaven and earth. And, of course, Pentecost is one time when there is a great deal of movement between heaven and earth. And so it's slightly odd in one sense that the scale in both cases is going upwards, whereas in Pentecost you might expect the scale to be going downwards, which incidentally Buxtehude does do in his other chorale prelude on the same melody. So it may or may not be symbolic in that sense. Anyway, let's get on with looking at it from a performance point of view. How about the general feel of it? And that's actually quite a difficult question, because one would expect a Pentecost chorale prelude to be full of drama and life, to be rather noisy, to have violent movements in different directions, to be a little bit unpredictable. And this chorale prelude is almost the antithesis of that. It's very reflective, very beautiful, very restrained. So I suppose you can look at it in a different way, this text, and say that it is a prayer for God to send spiritual gifts, and as such it's rather more restrained, rather more beseeching, more reflective. We can actually see that antithesis in Bach's two settings. We referred to the fact that Bach had written two of the Leipzig 18 chorale preludes on this same melody. And there, one of those is quite vigorous and the other quite reflective in rather the style of this Buxtehude piece. So perhaps Bach couldn't quite decide either, or wanted one of each. The first of those two of Bach's is that wonderful, fantastic, boisterous Fantasia, which is such enormous fun to play. I tend to play it every Pentecost service. It's an example of Bach really going to town and creating a large-scale chorale prelude of quite an extraordinary sort. But this Buxtehude piece seems to be pushing us into almost a romantic vision. It's something very beautiful, almost a bit yearning. So all these things feed into tempo and registration. Tempo, you remember perhaps that when we were talking about Bach, we talked a lot about harmonic rhythm as a determinant of tempo. The more harmonic changes there are in a bar, the slower the tempo needs to be in order to make sense of it all. And in this piece, there is a change of harmony, certainly on every crotchet beat. It seems like there's a change of harmony on every quaver beat, but very often that's a passing note or a passing harmony. But certainly on every crotchet beat. And therefore, the tempo needs to be a little bit restrained in order for that not to come across as rushed. And that in turn will give us a slightly more singing way of putting across the melody. So it will become that little bit more lyrical as a result. In terms of registration, it's fair to say that the standard go-to registration for this kind of music on a Baroque organ would be a sesquialtera, which is what I propose to use today, because that gives you something which is singing, something which is beautiful, but at the same time reasonably solid. Now, obviously, we can do the solo on a flute, 8-foot or 8 and 4-foot flute, and that will be slightly more fragile, but it will still be beautiful. You can, of course, even play the melody line on a 4-foot flute, but then you really are getting into dreamy land, and you're getting the melody floating rather dreamily above the accompaniment. And of course, a tremulant is by no means out of place in a German Baroque context. During the piece, this glorious figuration carries us through it, and it has its highs and lows of tension. In one sense, I think the piece almost arrives at a climax at the top C in bar 48 or so, the penultimate stanza, and works its way up to there and then back down again afterwards. The imitative figuration which immediately precedes that point, in a sense, underlines the fact that we're coming to a climax of sorts. But in any event, all through the piece, the figuration wants us to push things along steadily. The piece has a kind of internal impetus. Fingering and pedalling. Well, this is Buxtehude. You'll know if you've followed the series before, particularly the Bach episodes, that I don't lay down fast rules, but that especially in Buxtehude and pre-Bach music, it does seem very appropriate to at least take close consideration of historical fingering and pedalling practices. So that is to say, alternate feet on the pedals, so far as possible, toes, not heels, and we remember that there is no need to use toe and heel pedalling to achieve legato, especially between the offbeat and the following onbeat. So we can simply move our feet where necessary, because there was no expectation of the kind of steady legato that we would associate with 19th century music. The same thing really applies to fingering, that certainly the thumb was not passed under the fingers in order to achieve a legato which transcends hand positions. That's a general rule for 18th century music, and especially perhaps for Buxtehude. So those scales do not need the kind of associated board fingering that one would associate with an F major scale in normal circumstances in 19th century or 20th century music. Whether that means that you should be using 18th century fingering, that is another question which we won't address in this episode, and which I'll leave up to you. There are arguments both ways. But certainly bear the fingering in mind in deciding your articulation. The articulation should not be artificially legato. Ornaments, there's a couple of mordants and half a dozen trills. We can add a little bit of extra decoration here and there where it's necessary, particularly to keep the melodic line moving. The trills are interesting because all but 2 or 3 of them are on descending lines, where the note preceding the trill is the same as the note that you'll be trilling from, which means that you'll find yourself perhaps repeating the note you've just played as the upper auxiliary of the trill, which is not always good practice. And so we can ask ourselves, does that mean we should be starting the trills on the main note or repeating the note to start the trill? Well, where it's part of a succession of repeated notes, it's absolutely fine to repeat it. A third option, though, for those trills is to tie the note over into the trill so that you get your trill starting on the upper auxiliary, but that it's not actually physically repeated. So all those 3 options are available, and you can use the one which serves the purpose best. It won't necessarily be the same solution for each case. I'm recording this episode just before Easter, and many organists now are starting to think about Pentecost. And this particular piece I do recommend as the most wonderful chorale prelude to learn for Pentecost. It's not impossibly difficult, and it well repays the effort of learning it. So give it a try.